Most people remember Lee Kuan Yew as the man who made Singapore rich, clean, efficient, and impossible to ignore. They remember the skyline, the ports, the discipline, the confidence of a city-state that seemed to punch above its size in every direction. But that image came later. Long before the glass towers, the global finance reputation, and the aura of control, Lee was a boy born in colonial Singapore in 1923, a subject of the British Empire, growing up in a place that was prosperous in trade but politically dependent and strategically vulnerable. That vulnerability mattered. Singapore was not a nation with deep natural resources or geographic depth. It was a small island whose survival depended on forces larger than itself, and Lee would spend the rest of his life thinking about what that meant. His early world was shaped first by empire and then by its humiliation. During World War II, Japan occupied Singapore after the British surrender in 1942, and the fall of a supposedly impregnable imperial stronghold left a deep mark on people of Lee's generation. The lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Systems that look permanent can collapse in days, and small places survive only if they are harder, better organized, and more alert than the world around them. That is where Lee's real making begins. Not as the founding father already in command, but as a young man learning that weakness is dangerous, sentiment is insufficient, and politics in the end must answer the question of survival. He was not born as the finished architect of modern Singapore. He was assembled by colonial privilege, wartime shock, legal training, labor politics, anti-colonial struggle, and the realization that a fragile island could disappear if it did not build a disciplined state faster than history could swallow it. What changed everything was that Lee did not merely want independence in the abstract. He wanted a form of independence durable enough to last in a hostile region and a hard century. Before he became prime minister in 1959, before merger with Malaysia in 1963, before separation in 1965 forced Singapore into sovereignty on its own, he was already forming the convictions that would define him. That leadership meant preparation, that order mattered, and that a small nation could not afford the luxury of drifting. The real question in Lee's story is not how he became famous. It is how a colonial subject, shaped by occupation and uncertainty, came to believe he had to build a state tougher than its circumstances. Lee Kuan Yew was born on September 16, 1923, into a Straits Chinese family established in Singapore since the 19th century, and from the beginning his life sat at the intersection of local rootedness and colonial hierarchy. His first language was English, and he was educated in English medium institutions in Singapore, a fact that later mattered politically because he would have to acquire fluency in Chinese, Malay, and Tamil only after entering public life. He attended school in Singapore and studied at Raffles College until the Japanese occupation disrupted everything. The war years were more than a historical interruption. They were a moral shock. For his generation, Japanese rule exposed the fragility of British authority and the danger of assuming that larger powers would guarantee Singapore's safety. Lee later carried from that period a cold understanding that survival could not be outsourced. After the war, he resumed his studies and went to Britain, first briefly enrolling at the London School of Economics and then moving to Fitzwilliam House, Cambridge, where he earned a law degree in 1949 and headed the honors list. Cambridge did not turn him into a dreamy idealist. It sharpened him into something more formidable. A legal mind trained to argue, to structure power through institutions, and to think in systems rather than slogans. He was called to the English bar in 1950, but instead of disappearing into a comfortable professional life, he returned to Singapore. That return is one of the key emotional pivots in his life. He could have remained abroad and pursued personal success within the old imperial world. Instead, he went back to a colony in transition, where constitutional reform, labor conflict, anti-colonial pressure, and communist influence were all colliding. Once home, he worked as a lawyer and soon became a legal advisor to trade unions, representing workers in wage negotiations and building contacts among labor activists. This mattered because it gave him something more than professional status. It gave him a political base and taught him how mass politics worked on the ground. He was not being formed as an armchair constitutional thinker. He was learning how colonial power, working-class grievance, and ideological competition interacted in real time. Before Lee became the public face of Singapore, he was a colonial elite's son who had seen empire collapse, an outstanding student who chose return over escape, and a lawyer who found in labor politics the first real arena in which law, power, and popular feeling came together. By then, the future founder of Singapore was already visible in outline. Brilliant, disciplined, unsentimental, and increasingly convinced that politics would belong not to the most emotional voice, but to the person who understood institutions better than everyone else in the room. Lee's rise into politics did not begin as the triumph of a finished ideology. It began in a colony where constitutional reform was slowly expanding elected representation while communist and anti-colonial forces competed to shape the future. In the early 1950s, he formed alliances with other political newcomers and then broke away to define a harder, more strategic path of his own. He became Secretary General of the People's Action Party, founded in 1954. And the party from the beginning was both broad and unstable, including anti-colonial moderates and elements of the left that Lee believed he could use, but ultimately would have to defeat. In 1955, under a new constitution that expanded elected seats, the PAP won only 3 seats, but one of them was Lee's, and he quickly established himself in the Legislative Assembly as an unusually sharp debater and, in effect, a central opposition figure. He went to London as part of delegations seeking self-government for Singapore, and after renewed negotiations, he helped secure a constitutional path toward internal self-rule. Yet even this phase showed the pattern that would define much of his later life. He was willing to work through constitutional processes, but he had no romantic illusions about politics. The PAP itself became the site of a power struggle, and in 1957 Lee briefly lost and then regained the party's secretary generalship, proving both his vulnerability and his resolve. By 1959, under Singapore's new constitution, he campaigned as an anti-colonialist and anti-communist, while also calling for social reform and eventual merger with Malaya. The PAP won 43 of 51 seats, and Lee, still only 35, became Prime Minister of the self-governing state of Singapore on June 5, 1959. That moment is often remembered as a clear victory, but the reality was more complicated. Lee refused to form a government until detained left-wing PAP members were released, a move that reflected both political calculation and the unstable coalition inside the party. Within 2 years, the left broke away to form Barisan Sosialis, and Lee and the moderate wing of the PAP moved decisively to dominate Singapore politics. This is the real making of Lee as a political fighter. He was not simply a brilliant lawyer who drifted naturally into office. He was a strategist who understood that anti-colonial politics could be swallowed by communist organization if moderates failed to build structure quickly and ruthlessly enough. Before fame fully settled around him, he had already learned how to outmaneuver rivals, negotiate with imperial power, use elections without worshiping them, and turn a small party into the instrument that would carry him into history. The young lawyer had become something more dangerous and more durable, a state builder in waiting. If Lee's early political success made him prime minister, the years from 1959 to 1965 made him the founder of a nation he had not originally intended to lead alone. His first major project was not independence as a solitary island state, but merger with Malaya. In 1963, Singapore joined the newly created Federation of Malaysia, and Lee continued as Prime Minister of Singapore within that larger federation. The decision made strategic sense to him. Singapore lacked natural resources, water security, and strategic depth. Merger seemed to offer a larger national framework, consistent with his belief in multiracial politics and long-term survival. but the arrangement soon came under severe strain. The PAP's participation in Malaysian national politics heightened tensions, and communal unrest in Singapore during 1964 showed how dangerous the conflict could become. In August 1965, Lee was informed that Singapore had to leave the Federation. The separation was not his preferred outcome. Britannica notes that he had passionately believed in the multiracialism that the Federation represented, but Singapore nevertheless had to secede and became a sovereign state with Lee as its first prime minister. This was the moment that transformed him from a brilliant colonial and post-colonial politician into a founder under pressure. He was no longer maneuvering inside a framework set by Britain or Malaysia. He was responsible for the physical and political survival of a tiny new country surrounded by larger neighbors and exposed to regional instability. His answer was not sentimental nationalism. It was system building. He sought to retain Singapore's national identity, phase out dependence on British military protection gradually rather than recklessly, and build local defense capacity. At the same time, he pursued public housing, urban renewal, industrialization, education, and a disciplined administrative culture. In the late 1960s and 1970s, as Britannica's History of Singapore notes, the country pursued aggressive economic growth based on export manufacturing and trade, while also taking a more active regional diplomatic role and becoming a founding member of ASEAN in 1967. This part of Lee's story matters because it shows the emotional source of his famous severity. He was not governing a vast, civilizational state with room for grand failure. He was governing an island that, in his view, could disappear if standards slipped. That is why so much of his system emphasized competence, incorruptibility, education, public order, and national discipline. Before the world celebrated Singapore's success, Lee had already concluded that for a state this small, softness could be fatal. The wartime survivor and Cambridge lawyer had become the builder of a disciplined republic. The last act of Lee Kuan Yew's making is the one most people know, but it only becomes fully meaningful when seen against everything that came before. He remained prime minister until 1990, and over those 3 decades, Singapore changed beyond recognition. A small, resource-poor colony with high illiteracy became, as Britannica puts it, the most prosperous country in Southeast Asia, with a robust economy and one of the highest GDP per capita levels in Asia. Housing expanded, education widened, industry deepened. The state developed a reputation for competence and low corruption that contrasted sharply with many post-colonial outcomes elsewhere. For admirers, Lee looked like proof that disciplined leadership, meritocratic institutions, and hard realism could overcome weak starting conditions. But his rule was also marked by an authoritarian style of governance that limited political freedoms and kept the PAP dominant. Britannica explicitly notes that his tenure brought extraordinary development, while also being defined by a stringent governing style, and its history of Singapore points to developmental paternalism and discontent among those who expected greater openness and freer information. That tension is not an afterthought. It is central to understanding Lee. He believed deeply in results, but he never treated liberal openness as an unconditional good if it threatened cohesion, elite standards, or the long-term position of the state. In his mind, the island's vulnerability justified controls many other societies would resist. So the legacy he leaves is inseparable from that bargain. Singapore under Lee became richer, more orderly, more capable, and more globally relevant. It also became a place where the state expected unusual deference, where defamation suits and political constraints helped narrow the space for opposition, and where national success was often used as the strongest argument against political looseness. That is why his Before Fame story matters so much. Before he was the elder statesman, the global symbol of Singapore, and the father of a wealthy city-state, he was a colonial subject who saw empire collapse, a wartime survivor who learned that power cannot be trusted merely because it looks permanent, a brilliant lawyer who chose political. struggle over professional safety, and a politician who believed a tiny country could survive only by becoming more disciplined than its surroundings. That was the making of Lee Kuan Yew. Not simply the rise of a successful leader, but the rise of a man who turned insecurity into doctrine, doctrine into institutions, and institutions into one of the most durable national transformations of the modern age.